It was an ordinary afternoon in a quiet suburban neighborhood when tensions suddenly escalated. A white neighbor, suspicious of her new black neighbors, decided to call the police. She claimed something didn't feel right, even though no crime had been committed. Little did she know, the man she was targeting wasn't just any neighbor. He was a respected prosecutor with years of experience fighting for justice. As officers arrived, the situation quickly turned from uncomfortable to eye-opening. The prosecutor remained calm, but the question lingered. Would his status protect him from prejudice, or would he face the same biases so many others had endured? The encounter revealed more about the assumptions people carry and the dangers of making snap judgments. What happened next not only shocked the neighborhood, but sparked an important conversation about race, privilege, and accountability. Stay tuned to see how this story unfolds. The neighbor who made the call, Mrs. Carlson, had only recently moved in. She didn't know the man she'd seen standing outside was more than just a stranger. She wasn't aware of his professional background or his role in the community. To her, he was simply an unfamiliar face in a neighborhood she thought she understood. Her decision to dial 911 was fueled by a sense of unease, one that many black individuals face daily, even in places they should feel safe. As the police arrived, they saw the black man standing on his own porch, casually talking to his friend. But they also saw a white woman standing across the street, anxious, pointing in their direction. The prosecutor, now realizing what was happening, felt a sharp pang of frustration, not because he was being targeted, but because he knew this wasn't an isolated incident. In a split second, his experience could be overshadowed by assumptions. What would the officers do next? The officers stepped out of their cars, their hands resting cautiously on their belts. One of them approached Mrs. Carlson, who immediately began explaining her concerns in a hushed but hurried tone. Meanwhile, the prosecutor stood still, watching the scene unfold. His heart raced, not out of fear, but from the frustration of knowing what this looked like and how easily it could spiral out of control. His friend whispered, "Do you think they'll listen to you?" He didn't answer, but the weight of the question hung in the air. Mrs. Carlson's explanation was vague, something about suspicious activity and not feeling safe. But the officers had to take it seriously. One of them crossed the street toward the prosecutor. "Is everything all right here, sir?" the officer asked, his tone polite but guarded. The prosecutor nodded, keeping his voice calm. "I live here. Is there a problem?" His legal training told him to remain composed, but inside, a mix of anger and exhaustion brewed. Across the street, Mrs. Carlson kept glancing over nervously, as if unsure if she'd done the right thing. The officer hesitated, clearly unsure of how to proceed. The tension was palpable. Would they see the situation for what it truly was, or would bias cloud their judgment? The prosecutor knew he had to tread carefully, even in his own neighborhood. The officer's pause seemed to stretch for eternity. He glanced back at Mrs. Carlson, who stood wringing her hands, and then at the prosecutor, whose calm demeanor didn't match the picture she painted. Another officer joined in, his expression unreadable. "Do you have some ID, sir?" he asked. It was a loaded question, one the prosecutor had heard too many times before. He nodded and slowly pulled his wallet from his pocket, handing over his license. The officer studied it, his brows furrowing as he recognized the name. "Wait, he started, his voice trailing off. The prosecutor's reputation had preceded him, but it didn't erase the tension hanging over the moment. Mrs. Carlson noticed the shift in the officer's body language but couldn't hear their conversation. She started walking toward them, her curiosity overtaking her hesitation. "Is everything okay?" she called out, her voice shaky. The prosecutor looked at her directly for the first time, his calm gaze unwavering. "I live here, ma'am," he said, his tone steady but sharp. "And I'd like to know why you felt the need to call the police on me." Her face paled and she stammered, I didn't mean, I thought." But before she could finish, the officers exchanged an uncomfortable glance. The prosecutor's question had turned the spotlight onto her, and the weight of her assumptions was impossible to ignore. The neighborhood had fallen silent, neighbors peeking out from behind curtains. The air felt heavy, like something monumental was about to happen. Would this moment become another story of injustice, or could it lead to something greater? No one could predict what was coming next. Just as Mrs. Carlson opened her mouth to respond, another car pulled up to the curb. Out stepped a man in a suit, tall, confident, and clearly purposeful. It was the prosecutor's colleague, another attorney from the district office who had been invited over for a meeting. He looked between the officers, the prosecutor, and Mrs. Carlson, immediately sensing the tension in the air. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice cutting through the silence. The prosecutor didn't answer right away, but his friend quickly picked up on the situation. "Let me guess," the colleague said with a faint edge, looking toward Mrs. Carlson. "Another misunderstanding." Mrs. Carlson flushed, her discomfort now impossible to hide. The officers stiffened, realizing they were standing in the middle of something bigger than they anticipated. The prosecutor spoke again, his voice calm but carrying a weight that demanded attention. "I don't think this is just a misunderstanding. I think it's about more than that." The colleague nodded, stepping closer. "Mrs. Carlson, would you care to explain why you thought calling the police was necessary? Because from where I stand, it looks like you made an assumption that put lives at risk." Mrs. Carlson looked panicked now, her eyes darting between the officers and the two men who clearly weren't going to let this slide. Before she could say anything, another voice cut through the quiet, a neighbor stepping out of their house. "This isn't the first time she's done something like this," they said, their voice steady. The prosecutor and his colleague exchanged a glance, their expressions hardening. The officers now looked visibly uncomfortable, realizing this wasn't an isolated event. The tension mounted as all eyes turned back to Mrs. Carlson, the weight of the moment pressing down. What would happen next could change everything for her, for the prosecutor, and for the neighborhood watching it all unfold. The silence was heavy as Mrs. Carlson fumbled for an explanation, but before she could speak, the neighbor who had stepped out continued. "Last month, she called the police on the delivery driver too. Said he didn't look like he belonged here." Their voice carried across the street, drawing murmurs from a few others who were now stepping outside. The prosecutor, still calm but firm, turned back to Mrs. Carlson. "This isn't just about me then. This is a pattern." His words hit like a hammer, and for a moment, Mrs. Carlson's face was blank, as though she was struggling to process the weight of the situation. The officers, now visibly uneasy, shifted their stance. One of them cleared his throat. "Ma'am, it's important to understand that false reports waste resources and put people in danger," he said, his tone cautious but direct. But then came the twist no one expected. The prosecutor's colleague, who had been quietly observing, reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder. "This neighborhood has been flagged in the past for complaints of racially motivated incidents," he said, flipping through the papers. "It's part of why we've been working on a new community outreach initiative." Mrs. Carlson's eyes widened. "Wait, what does that mean?" she stammered. "It means," the prosecutor said, stepping forward, "this moment is bigger than you or me. It's about making sure things like this stop happening, not just here, but everywhere." His voice carried a quiet determination, and the crowd around them began to grow. Mrs. Carlson looked down, her discomfort now undeniable. The officers nodded, stepping back toward their cars, but not before one of them turned and said, "We'll be filing a report on this call." As the crowd started to disperse, the prosecutor and his colleagues stood together, watching as the neighborhood slowly returned to normal. But just before stepping inside, the prosecutor turned to the small group still lingering. "This isn't over. It's just the beginning of a conversation we need to have." And with that, he walked back into his home, leaving the neighborhood with much to think about and the audience with an ending that felt less like closure and more like a call to action.